Hello, I'm Bailey Leisure, and today on my channel I'm doing another video on the 2020 NFL Draft. As this will be my final video on the 2020 NFL Draft, as I'm going to be recapping some of the highlights in rounds 4 through 7 that happened in the 2020 NFL Draft, as well as give my winners and losers of who won the 2020 NFL Draft. So kind of in a surprise twist that happened on day 3 of the 2020 NFL Draft, there was some trades that happened on that day. It's involving NFL players, which is kind of a rarity, and it happened mainly for one team in specific, the San Francisco 49ers, as they made a ton of trades. So one of the rumored trade targets that was throughout this entire draft, as well as the rest of this offseason, was Trent Williams. He held out with the Redskins. He hasn't played in a couple years. All the drama that he was having with the Redskins. We heard about the bump that team doctors misdiagnosed, as he later found out it was a cancerous bump on his head. Just very messy. How I think a day prior to this trade that happened, the Vikings and the Browns were looking at him. In fact, I think the Vikings had, according to his agent, had a deal in place for Trent Williams, but he declined that. But he did get traded on this day, as he was traded to the San Francisco 49ers for a 5th round pick this year and a 2021 3rd round pick. I feel like the Redskins undersold him a little bit, but I think at this point, the Redskins just, they had enough. They wanted to clear themselves of Trent Williams. And as far as for the 49ers, that's a great pickup for them, getting one of the best offensive tackles that was available, and really helping out their offensive line for next year. So another trade that happened was in the 5th round, as Matt Breida, the running back for the San Francisco 49ers, kind of a backup running back for them, was traded to the Miami Dolphins for a 5th round pick. I think it was a good deal for the Miami Dolphins, who were looking for a running back. Probably could have taken a running back in the draft, but for a 5th round pick, it's a low risk, high reward kind of situation for the Dolphins. So a good pickup for them. And then the final trade that the San Francisco 49ers traded on that day was Marquise Goodwin, wide receiver Marquise Goodwin. They traded him to the Philadelphia Eagles and they both swapped 6th round picks. I think the 49ers had the 210th pick. The Eagles had the 190th pick, so they were able to jump up 20 spots in the 6th round. So, maybe a little bit of an undersell for the 49ers, but, I think they're really good at wide receivers, especially considering they drafted Brandon Ayuk in the 1st round. For the Eagles, they get more wide receivers, but it was a very interesting draft for them, to say the least. And I'll talk about their draft in a little bit. And now to talk about some draft picks in rounds 4 through 7, just talking about some notable ones. There weren't that many. But just talking about some highlights, starting off with at 112, the LA Chargers selected Joshua Kelly, running back at UCLA, so he won't be going that far away, as he'll be staying in LA. I think it's a solid pick for them. I'm not really giving grades on any of these picks that I have in these rounds. I'm just some quick thoughts. But it's a good pick. I think for them, obviously the Chargers lost Melvin Gordon in the offseason. But I think he's a good replacement. I think he could have been maybe even in the 3rd round. But it was a good pickup for the Chargers. The Arizona Cardinals had a couple 4th round picks, 2 of them to be specific, but they took defense in this round. As with the 114th pick, they took defensive tackle out of Utah, Leki Fotu. I don't know much about this guy, but I think he's pretty good. Definitely the Cardinals need help all around in the defense, especially on the line. So I think it's a good pick. I was really surprised at 131 they took Rashard Lawrence, another defensive tackle, as he's the defensive tackle coming out of LSU. It's kind of be interesting, considering both these guys are not going to be, one of them's probably going to get a roster spot. I think it's kind of really weird they took defensive tackles, 2 of them in the same round. But I think they're decent picks, because the Cardinals, they really needed to focus on defense in this draft, and they did so, especially here in the 4th round. With the 115th pick in this draft in the 4th round, the Cleveland Browns selected Harrison Bryant, tight end out of Florida Atlantic. I don't get this pick at all, especially with the fact that how many tight ends the Browns have on their roster. Maybe not as bad as the Bears, who have 10 tight ends on the roster. But I don't get it, because you still have David Njoku. You still have, you just got Austin Hooper, who was one of the top tight ends on the free agency market this offseason. So I don't get it. I mean, unless they're going to move on from Njoku. But I just don't get this pick for the Browns. So a couple quarterbacks fell after, when they could have been selected in the third round. One of the quarterbacks did get taken in the fourth round as the Indianapolis Colts selected Jacob Eason, quarterback out of Washington. I think the pick makes sense. They obviously, spent some money for 1 year. Phillip Rivers, he'll obviously be the starting quarterback for next season. And I think Jacob Eason's probably going to be, at least on paper, expected to be the next quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts. They still have Jacoby Brissett, but I feel like they're gonna move on. They're gonna move on from him soon. So Eason's he's got a good chance to being competing for the starting job in years to come for the Colts. With the 132nd pick, the Minnesota Vikings selected Troy Dye, linebacker out of Oregon. Pretty solid pick, and fills a need for the Minnesota Vikings. This was he was on one of the top remaining players on the draft board for a while, and he got picked up here in the fourth round. So I think this was a really good pick for the Minnesota Vikings. With the 144th pick, the Seattle Seahawks took DJ Dallas, running back out of Miami. I kind of don't get this pick, considering they have a couple of different running backs on their roster, but maybe they just don't expect. Maybe he could be a third stringer or something like that. Maybe he'll play special teams, but I don't really get this pick with the Seattle Seahawks. And then with the 146th pick in this draft, the Dallas Cowboys selected Tyler Biadasz. If I'm saying that correctly, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Center out of Wisconsin. He was an offensive lineman that was still on the board. One of the better offensive linemen, and the Cowboys were able to get him and continue their great draft. Obviously this is replacing Frederick, who retired in the offseason. So another really solid pick for the Dallas Cowboys. Moving on to the fifth round, not going to talk about many draft picks, only two players in this fifth round. But the first one I'll talk about is the Buffalo Bills with the 167th pick in this draft. They took Jake Fromm, quarterback out of Georgia. Kind of a surprise that he fell all the way to the fifth round, and kind of a weird place for him to end up. But initially I thought it was kind of weird, but now that I think about it, it kind of makes sense. Josh Allen hasn't quite developed as a passer. He's still kind of running a lot, and that's one of his best traits as a quarterback. So if he struggles or if he goes down with an injury, I think Fromm is a solid backup option. But I'm just surprised he fell to the Buffalo Bills. Kind of a weird choice. And then with the 179th pick, the Dallas Cowboys continued their excellent draft as they took Bradley Anae, defensive end out of Utah. This probably is going to be one of the replacements for Robert Quinn, who left in the offseason. I think this was a really solid pick for the Dallas Cowboys, and they had a really excellent draft, and I'll talk about their draft in a little bit. But I think this is another steal. In the sixth round, there weren't really that many highlights at this point. I mean, kickers and punters and even long snappers were getting drafted at this point. But I guess a notable player that got picked was the 192nd pick. The Green Bay Packers selected Jon Runyan Jr., guard out of Michigan. If that name sounds familiar, his father, Jon Runyan, was in the NFL for over a decade. I think was a Pro Bowler for the Philadelphia Eagles. So that lineage, there's a couple players that have had dads that were in the NFL. And he's another one of those that got picked up in this draft. And then in the seventh round, only going to talk about a few players in this draft round. As with the 222nd pick in this draft, the Chargers selected KJ Hill, wide receiver out of Ohio State. I think this was a really solid pick for the Chargers, who are obviously trying to build up that offense for Justin Herbert. But he kind of fell in this draft, KJ Hill. I thought he would have gone a lot sooner. I'm not even sure if he'll be one of those top wide receivers. Probably be like a special teams player. But I think this was a really good pickup in the seventh round for the Chargers. With the 222nd pick, the Arizona Cardinals selected Eno Benjamin, running back out of Arizona State University. I'm shocked that this guy fell. This guy probably could have been taken in the fourth round. I thought at worst he'd fall in the fifth round. But he goes to the Arizona Cardinals, stays in the desert. I think this is another great steal for the Arizona Cardinals. They had a couple steals in this draft, but this was a great solid pickup for them, and definitely improves that running back the running back depth. And then I'm not giving my thoughts on this draft pick, but the last draft pick, Mr. Irrelevant in this draft went at 255 as the New York Giants took linebacker Tay Crowder, linebacker, like I said, out of Georgia. Just some quick notes on this draft. LSU had a record in this draft of how many players from their college was drafted, as 14 players were drafted from LSU. Ohio State and Michigan were in second with 10. Alabama had 9. Clemson, Georgia, and Utah had 7 in this draft. So I felt like in those mid rounds, I felt like it seemed like every other player was either coming out of LSU, Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson. I just felt like there were a lot of players coming from those colleges, and there were. So the winners and losers of the 2020 NFL Draft, starting off with the winners. First on this list is the Arizona Cardinals. I think the big key for Steve Keim in this draft was to fix the defense, and he did so. At number 1, he took Isaiah Simmons, one of the steals in the first round. He had no second round pick, but think about it. What did they get for that second round pick? Well, it was part of the package that got them DeAndre Hopkins. So if you account DeAndre Hopkins, that's already a win right there. The third round, they took an offensive tackle that some people expected to go in the first round. So it was a huge steal for them and Josh Jones. They took 2 good defensive tackles in the 4th round pick. They took a linebacker in the 6th round pick, Evan Weaver. I don't know a lot about, but I heard he's good at tackling, so that's great. And then they took a running back to improve their depth position, a running back who people expected to go in the 4th round. So it was just a great draft for the Arizona Cardinals. Second on this list is the Dallas Cowboys. Kind of sounds weird to say that, but you know what? I got to give credit where credit's due. They had a great draft. They took a wide receiver that fell to them at CeeDee Lamb. It was a huge steal for them. They were able to put him up with Amari Cooper or Michael Gallup. They took a great cornerback in Trevon Diggs. They took Neville Gallimore, defensive tackle out of Oklahoma. They took a cornerback in this draft. They had a great 5th round, taking got a couple steals, and Bayadaz from Wisconsin, the center, and then Bradley Anae, defensive end out of Utah. They ended up taking a quarterback in the 7th round, which is probably just some depth on their quarterback position. But an excellent draft for the Dallas Cowboys. Third on this list is the Baltimore Ravens. I mean, they had an excellent draft, and as a team that's going to be contending in the AFC last year, they were able to load up. They got a great pick, in their first round with Patrick Queen, linebacker out of LSU, adding that defense that they're trying to beast up. They got a great running back in J.K. Dobbins to improve that run game. They had 4 third-round picks, and all their third-round picks were good. And Buki from Texas A&M, Devin Duvernay, a great weapon on the offense. They got Malik Harris out of Ohio State, Tyree Phillips, able to solidify that offensive line. They took a great wide receiver in the 6th round with James Procke. Just we're loading up on depth in some of those later rounds, but the Ravens, they had a great draft. 4th on this list is the Minnesota Vikings, who had a record 15 draft picks. I mean, that's just incredible. But the first round pick that they took, Justin Jefferson's a great wide receiver. Obviously I think this wide receiver's coming in to replace Stephon Diggs. This was actually one of the first round picks that they got after they traded Stephon Diggs to the Bills. But they also took a cornerback. They took Jeff Gladney, cornerback out of Texas Christian, helping improve that secondary. They took an offensive lineman in the 2nd round that could have went in the 1st round, in Ezra Cleveland. They just loaded up for the most part on defense. Looking at some of their draft picks, Troy Dye was a good pick in the 4th round. They got another wide receiver in the 5th. They got a quarterback in the 7th. They were able to really address every position that needed to be addressing, on offense, wide receiver, defense. They really just had a great draft, in my opinion. And then my final winner in this draft, I was debating with a couple teams, but I'm going to give it to the Cincinnati Bengals, who was one of the winners in this draft. Obviously, having the first overall pick in Joe Burrow, taking him, that was a great pick for them. They were able to get, in the 2nd round, a great wide receiver in T. Higgins. They pretty much stayed with defense for the rest of the draft. But, the Bengals, they have a lot more things to improve on, but I think this is a really good, good direction that they're going in with this draft. And, hopefully they can improve on that 2-14 record that they had last season. Then I'm going to start with the losers in this draft. I feel like the losers in this draft are pretty obvious, but the first team I'm going to talk about are the Green Bay Packers. I mean, they're just... what can I say about that first round draft pick that they took, trading up to get him and Jordan Love? Nothing against Jordan Love, but we've seen the Packers do this before. The thing that doesn't make sense at all with this draft pick is the fact that why are you taking a quarterback now? I mean, you guys were one game away from going to the Super Bowl last season. That just doesn't make sense. Some of the other, they took A.J. Dillon, who's okay. They took tight ends, a linebacker, a guard, a center, another guard, a full safety, and a defensive end. They took no wide receivers in this draft, in a draft that was very, very loaded at wide receiver. All they really have right now is Devontae Adams. So they pretty much for the most part ignored the key offensive positions such as wide receiver in this draft, and it's just not a great draft for the Packers. And it could be really combustible in that front office and in that locker room with Jordan Love. Nothing against Jordan Love, but more so the fact that this could lead to the departure of Aaron Rodgers, and we could potentially not see him finish his career in Green Bay. The Houston Texans, I think, are pretty obvious. This team only had 5 draft picks. Think about it. They threw everything at Laramie Tunsil, which, okay, Laramie Tunsil, you address a need at the offensive line position, but too much investment on that position, if you ask me. And then you traded away Davion Clowney for pretty much nothing, and then you traded DeAndre Hopkins, a top 3 wide receiver, for a running back who hasn't had great production since 2016. You swap 4th round picks, and you can only get a 2nd round pick. They only had a 2nd round pick because they traded their best receiver, on their roster. Nothing against Ross Blacklock, which was what they took in the 2nd round, but that just didn't make sense at all. Looking at some of the other positions they took an outside linebacker, an offensive tackle. They took a wide receiver in the 5th round. Just not inspiring when it comes with this draft, and yikes. Bill O'Brien, that's no more words there. Philadelphia Eagles definitely are a loser. I could have probably talked about them before the Houston Texans, but I'm talking about them afterwards. They took a wide receiver in the 1st round, which I didn't, Jalen Reagor, they addressed the position they needed to address, but why not? What was wrong with Jefferson or Brandon Ayuk? Also, a player that you wanted, you decided not to trade up to get him in CeeDee Lamb, and he ends up falling to your division rival in the Dallas Cowboys. I think in this draft they traded with the Dallas Cowboys for a draft pick, which didn't make sense. And then the Jalen Hurts draft pick. Nothing against Jalen Hurts, but you invested that much in a backup quarterback, a 2nd round pick, way too much. They took another wide receiver, a couple other wide receivers. They traded for Marquise Goodwin. I think those first 2 picks that they made in my opinion, just were not great moves. And, the Eagles, not a great draft for them. Another loser in this draft was the New England Patriots, who had a lot of draft picks. I think they were 2nd in draft picks behind the Minnesota Vikings. I didn't really, they really didn't address the offense other than the tight end position. They didn't take any wide receivers. They didn't take any running backs. Although that's not really an offense that runs a lot. But they took 2 tight ends in the 3rd round. They took a kicker in the 5th round. I know Bill Belichick, he's got a good defense, but they didn't take a quarterback either in this draft, which, I'm just not convinced that Jarrett Stidham's the long-term answer for the New England Patriots. We've seen, nobody expected Tom Brady to be the best quarterback of this, the last 20 years, but, there he was. But I just don't like what the Patriots what they're going into next season with this draft class. And then the Pittsburgh Steelers, another team that probably should have addressed the quarterback position in this draft, but didn't. They had no 1st round pick, but to be fair, they did get, that 1st round pick that they traded during last season was for Minkah Fitzpatrick, and he was a really good pickup for them. They took a wide receiver, which was a good move on their part. I don't know why they didn't take a running back sooner, just because I think that's a need with this offense, especially with an aging Ben Roethlisberger, who's pretty much at the end of his career. I think they took a couple of defensive positions. I really think they should have went all offense in this draft. So kind of a questionable draft for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And those were my thoughts on rounds 4 through 7 of the 2020 NFL Draft. That concludes my coverage on the 2020 NFL Draft. Who were the winners and losers of this draft? Leave in the comments section below. As always, follow me on Twitter at Laser96. Click like if you like the video, and subscribe if you like the content of my channel. So thanks everybody for watching. Hope you're staying safe out there, and I will see you all later.